Tonight we're going to hear from Kevin Flannery, who is the Dean of the Faculty of Philosophy and the Ordinary Professor of the History of Ancient Philosophy at Pontifical Gregorian University. This talk is co-sponsored by the Medieval Studies Workshop, and we're very grateful to them for the co-sponsorship. I met Kevin Flannery several years ago in Rome on my first visit to Rome as an adult, really, and have been fortunate enough to meet him every other time I've been in Rome since. He is one of my favorite interlocutors on Thomas Aquinas, on Anscombe, on ethics and moral questions more generally. He is an extraordinary person, a stunning scholar of Aristotle and of Aquinas, who can convince even me that the two are much closer than I would ever have thought possible. He is the author of Acts Amid Precepts, which is a reading of the Aristotelian logical structure in Aquinas' moral theory. He's just completed a work on character and action. He is the author of very many articles. Reading any one of them gives you this, even a tiny one, like the one I was reading this morning, which he told me is too old, like it's from '93 or something, so it's ancient. You enter into this absolutely careful, precise, not at all pretentious, open, honest wrangle with very serious topics, done with great love and care by somebody who just knows more than you ever will. This is sort of my experience. And so I am grateful to have the chance to introduce Kevin Flannery. Welcome.
Thank you, Candace, for that kind introduction, most of which is nonsense, of course. And thanks to all of you for coming out this evening in this horrible weather. And thanks especially to the Lumen Christi Institute for inviting me. So thanks all around. The title, which appeared on the posters for this talk, is an earlier title. I changed the title, not drastically, but the title was originally The Capacious Mind of Thomas Aquinas, and the title is now, in a sort of fit of alliteration, I came up with this title. It's The Calm, Capacious, Consistent Mind of Thomas Aquinas. Okay? A couple of difficult moral cases have attracted fairly recently the attention of the news media. The event associated with the first case occurred in November 2009 in Phoenix, Arizona, and came to general attention a few months later when the local bishop, Thomas Olmsted, declared the excommunication of a Sister of Mercy who had been involved in a decision to allow doctors to abort the fetus of a woman with worsening symptoms of pulmonary hypertension. An ethicist asked by the hospital to investigate the case subsequently argued that the procedure used did not go against Catholic teaching. The event associated with the second case occurred in October 2012 in Galway, Ireland. An Indian woman, Savita Halapanavar, pregnant and hemorrhaging, or miscarrying, died apparently of septicemia. This occurred according to the opponents of Ireland's anti-abortion laws after she was refused an abortion that would have saved her life. The details of neither case are entirely clear. the medical records of the Phoenix case have never been made public, so that it's uncertain whether the life of the child might have been saved even without the intervention. The Galway case is currently being investigated by an Irish governmental commission, which is yet to release its findings. Entering into the details of either case, however, would distract us from the issue I wish to place before you this evening, since even if with further information it would be possible to say truthfully that the Phoenix case involved a perfectly moral act, an indirect or therapeutic abortion, or that the death that occurred in the Galway case might have been avoided by a similar act, there are still cases or situations in which Catholic moral teaching, based as it is upon Thomas Aquinas' understanding of human action, would require one to refrain from directly killing a child in the womb, even in order to save the life of the mother. The basic principle at work here is that enunciated by St. Paul in the letter to the Romans. One ought not to perform evil in order to achieve good. It is the same principle that prohibits one from killing an innocent person, even if one is absolutely certain that if one does not do so, evil men will kill hundreds of other innocent persons. While acknowledging that some deliberate acts that lead inevitably to the death of an innocent might be moral, if the act in question is of a lethal nature, and at the receiving end is an innocent person, it cannot be performed morally. Similarly, according to St. Thomas, one cannot tell a lie, even an officious lie, such as would save the life of another, since the object of such an act, the receiving end, is a person deceived, and the nature of such speech acts is to inform, not to deceive. In either of these cases, if one looks honestly at what one is doing, looks at the act that will kill an innocent child or the act that will deceive another, one sees that in itself, independently of other circumstances, it is disordered. No ulterior good to be achieved can justify the performance of such an act. To publicly defend such a position is to do something that will inevitably draw the ire and opprobrium of, if not a large, then certainly a very vocal and influential segment of contemporary society. This has become apparent especially in Ireland. In fact, in their official response to criticisms of the Church regarding the Galway case, the Irish bishops have not said explicitly what they must hold. That is, that there are cases in which an abortion may not be performed even in order to save the life of a mother. And yet, even still, they have been savagely attacked by the proponents of more permissive abortion laws. The same bishops are, of course, still reeling from the abuse scandal, the child abuse scandal, the sexual abuse scandal in that country, and doubtless sense that they are in an awkward position to be calling others to take difficult positions, to difficult moral stands. And yet there are compelling reasons why they and we should follow Thomas Aquinas' teaching in this regard. Indeed, there are reasons why they and we should recognize that going down the path his teaching points to is the only one that will truly bring peace to our hearts and to society in general. I shall discuss two reasons that complement one another, the first the second, and the second the first. The first reason is, put quite simply, the impression one has as one reads Thomas's writings that one is hearing the thoughts of one who knows, one who speaks the truth. The second, which I shall consider much more briefly than the first, is the self-apparent, disordered character of such acts as lying and murder. If, as is true, Thomas's vast learning gives one confidence that one is not being led astray as one follows him in placing such emphasis upon the self-apparent, disordered character of certain acts, so also his refusal to ignore, politically to look away from, such disorder engenders the realization that here is a man radically committed to pursuing the truth. The second reason, what Thomas calls the per se character of certain acts, is more compelling, that is, logically more compelling than the first, although appreciation of the first is likely, at least initially, to be more persuasive than the second. So let us begin with the first reason. Briefly, that is, basically, that Thomas's voice has the ring of truth. As I have said, this will be the main focus of this talk, hence its title, The Calm, Capacious, Consistent Mind of Thomas Aquinas. An important contributing factor here is the sheer extent and solidity of Thomas's of his learning. He had an astoundingly retentive memory and an almost preternatural ability to grasp the point of arguments obscure for either textual or stylistic reasons. According to Bernard Guidonis, or Gui, he once told his students that, and I quote, he had never read a book which, aided by the divine spirit, he did not understand. One sees this especially in his commentaries on Aristotle. Most of these, including the commentary on the De Anima, on the physics, on the metaphysics, and on the Nicomachean ethics, to name just the most important, were written towards the end of his life. But even before writing these commentaries, he knew well the works to which they pertain, for he had studied them, together with commentators out of the Arabic world, under the tutelage of Albert the Great in Paris and then Cologne. Because he knew his writing so well and was so adept at interpreting Aristotle by means of Aristotle himself, in whatever work these words might appear, Thomas could often divine the correct point of passages that others, with more advanced linguistic and philological tools, failed and continue to fail to grasp. He also wrote important commentaries on works by Boethius and Pseudo-Dionysius, and on the Liber de Causas, which he was the first scholar to recognize as non-Aristotelian. At some point, certainly very early in his life as a student, Thomas mastered the principles of logic. He rarely cites a logical work explicitly, but his logical acumen is always implicit in his analysis and breaks the surface as needed. One sees this, for instance, in his much-discussed treatment of the analogy of truth, which depends ultimately on the distinction between that from which a name receives its sense and the thing signified in a particular instance. Another example would be his use of the already mentioned per se, the concept of the per se intelligible, which is traceable to Aristotle's posterior analytics, that is his logic, at least part of his logic. It's sometimes forgotten, however, especially by philosophers, that Thomas's main academic responsibilities were always the teaching of theology. Accordingly, he studied closely the acts of the early councils of the Church. It comes, however, as something of a surprise to be informed by Father James Weishaupt, OP, that sometime between 1260 and 1263, that is, only after the conclusion of his first teaching appointment at the University of Paris, when he had returned to Naples, did Thomas discover the acts and the proceedings of the early councils. But once he had easy access to these documents by way, for instance, of the collection of manuscripts really at Monte Cassino, not far from Naples, he made good and frequent use of them. As Weishaupt reports, Thomas, and I quote, was the first Latin scholastic writer to utilize verbatim the acts of the first 5 ecumenical councils of the Church. Similarly, Father Jean-Pierre Torel, another Dominican and Thomas's other major 20th century biographer, calls attention to what he terms a notable fact, that, and again I quote, Thomas, along with Albert, his master, from whom no doubt he learned this habit, belonged to that rare category of authors at that time who are not content with florilegia, that is, collections of quotations, and frequently have direct recourse to the sources themselves. As a mature theologian and as a preacher, Thomas, of course, needed to know Holy Scripture. Among his remaining works, therefore, are commentaries upon Isaiah, Jeremiah, Job, the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of John, several letters of St. Paul, and the letter to the Hebrews. Also, his early duties at the University of Paris involved commentary upon Scripture, written evidence of which does not always survive. All of the surviving commentaries give ample evidence not only of Thomas's knowledge of Holy Writ, but also of the Church Fathers, especially Jerome, Augustine, and John Chrysostom. His methodology called for not only making sense of the text, but also of reporting what sense others had found in it. This latter concern, together with a request by Pope Urban IV, gave birth to the Catena Aurea, the Golden Chain, a collection of glosses on the Gospels by the Church Fathers just mentioned, but also by several less-known figures, such as the 11th century Theophylactus of Ochrida, of whom I'd never heard before. One could continue in this way, listing the sources of which Thomas was master, mentioning, for instance, his knowledge of classical authors such as Cicero, or his knowledge of Roman law, but the point, I think, has been made sufficiently, that the sheer extent of Thomas's knowledge is reason to believe him, to agree with him. The large extent of any scholar's knowledge itself makes it more likely that what he says, even the uncomfortable things he says, are true. If one is interested in consistency, and Thomas certainly was, the more content there is to a body of knowledge, and the more consistent sense that can be made of it, the more likely it is that even the more difficult theses drawn from that body of knowledge will be true. But accumulated knowledge, accumulated sources themselves, are not enough to produce the trust that gives conviction to difficult choices. We all know people who know a lot and whose advice we would never follow when making important decisions. One of the problems with human knowledge is that it leads very easily to arrogance and pride. And arrogance and pride are the enemies of truth. They are what make a scholar indulgent regarding his own lapses of logic, and unthinkingly closed to the possibly sound criticisms of colleagues, who in turn often perceive more clearly inconsistencies in the arguments of others rather than in their own arguments. So it is also significant and reassuring that in reading Thomas's writings, one encounters nothing that ever smacks of arrogance or pride. It is sometimes said that Thomas's writings are impersonal. And this is certainly true in the sense that he almost never allows his own person to intrude upon the line of thought he is laying before his reader. He almost never, for instance, speaks in the first person. One exception is the exquisitely beautiful Adoro te Devote, which is, however, of course, not a philosophical or theological treatise, but a personal hymn of praise. And yet, even within the necessarily impersonal format of a treatise, Thomas's calm and judicious personality is always present. The more one reads him, the more one comes to recognize his confident but never insistent voice. He is interested only in examining the problem at hand as fairly as possible. Thomas's writings are devoid of rhetoric in the negative sense. One notices this, for instance, in the way he sometimes answers a question by listing a number of options. Habituated as we are to more journalistic styles in which a writer or other pundit sets out a number of answers to a particular question in order inevitably to say that they are all wrong-headed except for his own, which he forthwith propounds, we expect Thomas to do the same. But what we find, and what takes some getting used to, is that he is quite likely to go on to say that all of the options represent the truth from a particular perspective, or that, for instance, of 4 options, 2 of them do, and then he explains why. We find this same composed attitude in his answers to objections, in especially the Summa Theologiae. The literary form deliberately adopted in that work calls for setting out first the objections to the position to be defended, then, after a brief, often scriptural interlude, the exposition of that position itself in the so-called body of the article, as you all know, and finally answers to the objections. In the latter section, one again almost expects a rhetorical putting down of the opposing positions. But not infrequently, Thomas accepts the position set out in the objection, with only a slight qualification, saying, for instance, that the objection is sound given certain presuppositions put forth in the body of the article. Sometimes he even writes something like, et hoc concedimus, and this we concede, thereby implying or occasionally explaining that the objection does not contradict the position that Thomas defends once it's properly understood. That such calm and charitable exposition was no imposed literary form, that Thomas was like this in person, becomes evident in what we know about his intellectual encounters with others, such as the Franciscan John Peckham, a passionate intellectual by all accounts, who eventually became Archbishop of Canterbury. Bartholomew of Capua, who in 1290 became the equivalent of the Prime Minister of Sicily, had, as a young man, frequented the Dominican Priory in Naples while Thomas was living there. He was also on familiar terms with a number of Thomas's closest Dominican confreres, including Reginald of Piperno, Thomas's private secretary and sometime confessor. In sworn testimony given to one of the commissions set up to consider the canonization of Thomas, he writes that he had heard from several Dominicans that when at one point at the University of Paris, Thomas disputed with John Peckham, as much as the latter, and I quote, exasperated the same Friar Thomas, with his bombastic and puffed up words. For his part, Friar Thomas never held back a word of humility, but responded always with kindness and humanity. In William of Toco's Life of St. Thomas Aquinas, there's a similar story which a number of authorities, scholars, associate with the same John Peckham. The setting is again the University of Paris, where Thomas's teaching has been attacked by a young master just beginning his career. Thomas, we are told, answered not at all, but, and I quote again, returned with his confreres to his convent, quiet and tranquil in both mind and word. Those who accompanied him, however, remarked, and again I quote, "Master, we are greatly offended on your behalf, because that master ought not to have spoken against your opinion, and you ought not to have put up with this injury to the truth before all the Parisian masters." Thomas replied, writes his biographer, more in attitude than in words, "My sons, I sought to spare the new master as he commences, lest he be embarrassed before all the other masters." And this is the phrase that I like very much. "Regarding my own teaching, however, which by God's grace I have made firm by the authority of the saints and the reasonings of truth, being contradicted by whatever teacher does not cause me to doubt. If, however, you, my brothers, think otherwise, tomorrow I can supply what I omitted." And so the next day, according to acceding to the reasonable promptings of his confreres, Thomas did just that, eliciting from his younger interlocutor not only an acknowledgement that he had been in error, but also a humble request to be explained the truth. It might be objected that the sources just mentioned are extremely favorable to Thomas. Both testimonies were in fact part of the canonization process, that is, his own canonization process. Fortunately, however, we have a letter written in 1285, 11 years, that is, after Thomas's death, by Peckham himself, in which he apparently describes the same incident, although his recollections differ somewhat from what we read in the other two accounts. He first recounts that he had been accused by an English Dominican of having attacked Thomas's position on the unicity of substantial form. And he says that this is false, that he was accused. On the contrary, he writes, and I quote, "When, for this opinion, Thomas Aquinas was subject to crafty argumentation by the Bishop of Paris and the masters of theology, and even by his own confreres, we alone stood by him." You notice the episcopal we alone stood by him, defending him as well as we were able, while maintaining the truth, while he, as a humble teacher, submitted all of his positions, such as might be subject to correction, to the authority of the Parisian masters. Peckham implicitly acknowledges that Thomas and he were not entirely in agreement on the occasion. Peckham, as we've just heard, speaks of defending Thomas as well as we were able while maintaining the truth. But also, in effect, he confirms the testimony of Bartholomew of Capua and William of Toco that Thomas, even when unfairly attacked, typically reacted with modesty and reason. Immediately after the remark just quoted, Peckham lets loose with a more characteristic assessment of unnamed others. And again, I quote, "We did not attack him," that is Aquinas, "but rather the arrogance of certain others who, more inflated than competent, more audacious than qualified, more garrulous than literate, presume to teach that of which they are ignorant, luring gullible youths to the same," which is kind of more, actually, he's got a certain flair, that's Peckham does. Peckham does not say what position these certain others maintained, but it's possible that they too defended the doctrine of the unicity of substantial form, that is to say, Thomas's own position. So my argument up to this point has been that given Thomas's vast knowledge of both ecclesial and secular tradition, combined with his insistence on consistency, his honesty, and his openness to correction in the interest of truth, we have reason to follow him even when he propounds certain difficult and unpopular theses. This is not to say, however, that even given these factors, we are obliged to accept as true everything he says. A case in point would be the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. In an article in the Summa Theologiae, asking the question whether the Blessed Virgin was sanctified before her ensoulment, Thomas says that this occurred after her ensoulment, after her animation, as he puts it. But in 1854, Pius IX declared infallibly that, and I quote, "In the first instance of her conception, Mary was preserved immune from every stain of original sin." In this case, however, close attention to the formulations employed by the two parties reveals that Pius IX was careful to contradict Thomas as incidentally as possible. Thomas's concern was to preserve the truth that even Mary had need of the Savior of all men, Jesus Christ, which he thought could not be the case unless she began animated existence with original sin. For his part, Pius IX was concerned not to compromise the same truth, for he says in the same document that her preservation from even original sin was by virtue of the merits of Jesus Christ, Savior of the human race. Almost the same language. Whereas in the Summa, Thomas considers just two possibilities. Mary was preserved from original sin either before, ante, or after, post-animation. Pius IX squares the circle, so to speak, by declaring that she was so preserved in the first instant of her conception. In his reflections upon Mary's special sanctity, Thomas is clearly reaching for the truth that Pius IX eventually declared, and which Thomas would certainly have accepted. His failure to lay hold of this truth was due to his eminently reasonable concern not to contradict so established a doctrine as Christ's universal salvific mission. There are, however, in Thomas, ideas or theses that we ought definitely not to accept, that we ought to reject. A prominent example would be what he says about the delayed ensoulment of the human embryo. Adhering to ideas set out in Aristotle's The History of Animals, Thomas says that the rational soul, the only truly human soul, arrives after 40 days of gestation for males and 90 for females. As I explained to my students, that the issue here is that females are just more complicated. They kind of take more time to develop. So a handful of contemporary scholars have seized upon this position and used it as part of an argument that the Church ought not to speak of abortion in the very early days of pregnancy. But the way to answer such an argument is obvious. There's no reason why we, or the Church, ought to revert to the biology of the 13th century, derived, as it was in this case, from the biology of ancient Greece. By no means, however, is this to reject the Aristotelian or Thomistic philosophical analysis of the genesis of the human soul. Aristotle tells us that his reason for placing ensoulment at 40 and 90 days is that in his experimentations, before these two moments, he did not see articulation, that is, organic differentiation, in the respective embryos. To his eye, the early embryo was, as he puts it, structureless meat. And since in animals there can be no soul without an organic structure to support the soul, the rational soul could not be present. He maintained that in order for there to be a human rational soul, there had to be present at least some physical structure that could develop into a nervous system, a prerequisite for the existence of a human intellect. This is a reasonable thing to maintain, since if it were not true, it would be possible for a human soul to be present anywhere, in a robot, a radish, or a rock. More alliteration, excuse me. Today, of course, we know that there is in the human embryo a great deal of structure dynamically ordered toward the development of a thinking adult right from fertilization. So, following Aristotle's and Thomas's own philosophical general principles in this regard, there's no reason to deny that the human rational soul is present from that very moment, that is, from fertilization. The example of delayed ensoulment demonstrates that one who appreciates Thomas Aquinas need not commit himself to an undifferentiated or unthinking adherence to Thomas's, or for that matter, Aristotle's stated conclusions. The criterion to be used in sifting through issues is, however, one that Thomas himself employed unfailingly: consistency with respect to established ideas. Aristotle referred to this as accounting for the phenomena. He says that in the Metaphysics. It is due largely to this procedural principle and not to any particular biological theses that the Aristotelian Thomistic approach to the relationship between mind and body is still a major player in contemporary philosophy, and the majority approach of those who would associate the human mind with the human soul, or with the form of the body. Consistency with respect to established ideas is perforce consistency with respect to common sense. With this principle always in the background, a theory is more likely to retain plausibility, which is a mark, if not an infallible mark, of the truth. That brings us at long last to the second reason why we should follow Thomas Aquinas' teaching regarding the two cases with which we began: refusal to tell a lie and refusal directly to kill the innocent, even in difficult situations. In both cases, Thomas invokes Aristotle. That is, the Aristotelian understanding of the per se, what something, in this case an act, is in itself. Something that is true per se is true in a way that cannot be doubted. Capacious, to use Aristotle's example, is per se capacious. An act of building, given that it is an act of building, is per se an act of building. These examples they are, in a sense, redundant and tautological. But that's the very point. There is no more room for doubt than there is in such statements, no more room for doubt than there is room to doubt that the person Capacious, given that we are referring to Capacious, is Capacious. Similarly, according to Thomas, there is no room for doubt that telling the truth is well ordered, but lying is not, and that respecting the innocent is well ordered, but killing the innocent is not. The per se is the basis of the whole system, of Thomas's capacious knowledge itself. As already suggested, there's a sort of reciprocal relationship between individual per se truths and the general consistency of the knowledge that a person such as Thomas Aquinas has. Not only, as I have been arguing up until this point, does the capacious consistency of Thomas's mind give us reason to follow his teaching in particular instances, but the particular truths that he identifies as per se and his refusal to paper them over are the deeper source of the confidence in his general teaching that he generates in others, even in those who do not insist upon his per se truths quite as much as he does. With respect to lying, then, Thomas is frequently criticized regarding two of his positions. The first is that it is a sin, a venial sin, to tell a jocose lie, that is, to tell an untruth simply for the sake of amusement. An example would be someone's telling another that his hat is on fire when he knows that it's not, and he knows too that the other will become aware of this immediately. The other position is that it is a sin, again a venial sin, to tell a lie in order to save lives. Again, this is the so-called officious lie. In order to understand why Thomas takes these positions, it is useful to bear in mind two things. First, that according to Thomas, a lie is essentially, according that is to its form or species, signifying as true what one does not believe is true with the intention to deceive. Secondly, that to such an essence may be added aspects that make it seriously sinful, such as the intention that the other person go away completely deceived, or the intention to harm another, say harm a reputation. So with respect to both these cases, the jocose lie and the officious lie, the primary reason why Thomas insists that, even given the extenuating circumstances, they are sins, although venial sins, is that to deny this would be to deny what is apparent in considering a lie. Language is a good thing, created ultimately by God and developed subsequently by man. Its goodness consists in its ability to convey the truth. When this does not happen, something is disordered. Not necessarily seriously disordered, but still disordered. We see the per se good nature of truth-telling if we consider the implausibility of maintaining that the point of language, its essence, is to propagate falsehood, that it was made for this purpose by God or by man. If that had been the original purpose of language, the whole business of talking and writing would never have gotten started. It is perfectly reasonable to say language is for communicating truth, although it can also communicate falsehood. It is simply bizarre to say language is for communicating falsehood, although it can also communicate truth. How else to account for this difference other than to say that, in some sense, deliberate false saying is a falling away from what language is meant to do? It is the plain obviousness of the fact that language's natural goodness lies in truth-telling and not its opposite that prevents Thomas from ever giving lying a wholly clean bill of health. To do so would be to go against his deepest instincts, to say that what was before his mind's eye was not there, to deny the truth. Of course, a lie told, for instance, in order to damage a reputation is not a venial sin. It rises to the full foulness of that type of act. but its disordered essence it shares with the jocose and the officious lie. What is this essence? Well, what I have already described, what the act is, telling an untruth with the intention of deceiving. Such an act can be performed without violating justice or charity, as when one knows that the deception will last just a moment. But there is no denying what it is, that is its essence, its species. There is no denying, that is, its disorder. That brings us finally to the case of killing the innocent in order to achieve some other benefit, such as the life of a mother. The situation here is both different from and the same as that of lying. That is to say, presupposing that an action is the deliberate killing of an innocent, such as a fetus, it is not ever possible that it could be only a venial sin, since such an act violates justice in the most radical way possible. So, whereas lying can sometimes be venial, killing the innocent can never be such. On the other hand, the moral analysis of both types of action, both lying and killing the innocent, depends on the per se character of the act, which has to do not with the seriousness of the sin, whether it is venial or mortal, but with what it is, its species. As with lying, the disorder of an act of killing an innocent is apparent on its very countenance. There are certain things, Thomas says, that the natural reason of any man immediately and per se judges either to be done or not to be done. That's a quotation. Among the latter, he goes on to say in the same passage, is killing the innocent. As he remarks in another work, one of the quadlibetal questions, and I quote, "A homicide is always a sin since disorder is attached to it inseparably," unquote. He makes this remark, in fact, in an article about whether lying is always a sin. And there he uses exactly the same language of lying, about lying. It is, and again I quote, "an act to which disorder is attached inseparably." So with respect to what homicide is, that is its species, as with lying, there are no exceptions. But unlike lying, homicide is always seriously disordered, a violation of basic justice, even when the killing might save the life of a mother. This is a hard teaching, obviously. There are things that can and should be said to render it less off-putting. In the first place, in the present political situation in the Western world, no pro-life politician need ever say that he favors legislation that would prohibit abortion even when the life of the mother is in grave danger. It would be quite impossible to pass such legislation in any Western democracy today, and politics is the art of the possible. This is not to say, however, that any Catholic hospital should ever allow direct abortions, such as quite likely occurred in Phoenix in 2009. Secondly, a follower of Thomas Aquinas can recognize that certain acts, as a consequence of which an innocent person inevitably dies, are not immoral in any sense. The classic case of this type is that of a woman whose cancerous uterus needs to be removed, even though she is pregnant. For well over a century now, the Catholic Church has been saying that such a procedure, a type of therapeutic abortion, might be performed. I have argued elsewhere that with certain technological advances, an analogous procedure might allow doctors to save the lives of mothers, in situations such as the situation that presented itself in Phoenix in 2009. All that said, however, one cannot reasonably deny that some actions that would allow a surgeon to save the life of a mother are direct killings. They head straight at the body of an innocent person and do to that body things that kill it. Such are acts to which, as St. Thomas puts it, disorder is attached inseparably. If, as part of his commitment to the truth, he could not say that the officious lie, lying in order to save the life of another, was not disordered, he would not be able to say that such a direct act against the life of an innocent is not similarly, but more gravely disordered. It was this grace-induced love of the truth, even difficult truth, that produced in St. Thomas his calm, capacious, and consistent mind. Thank you.